Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. It is the week of September 8th, 2024, and tonight's episode is called The One Where Joel Vents. And I'm going to explain, obviously, what that title means in just a little bit. But first, I actually want to try something new on the pod and flip things around. Tonight, I'm going to begin with your questions that many of you sent in, and a lot of them were similar, so I sort of combined them and attributed them to the one who expressed it the most poignantly. But there are three questions I want to start with, and I think they're going to set up our episode very well because these, in fact, reflect what Israelis are going through and what we're talking about. So, question one comes from Karen from Highland Park, Illinois. And her question is, do you think Israel should agree to give up control of the Philadelphia corridor in Gaza and agree to a time-limited ceasefire in exchange for the release of all the hostages? It's a great question. To remind you, the Philadelphia corridor, it's basically a fancy name for the road that runs along the border between Gaza and Egypt. And there's been a lot of suspicion that it was over this road or under this road that Hamas was able to get all of its weapons and cement and everything else into Gaza to create their terror system. Whether it's the rocket launchers, the tunnels they were able to build, that this border between Gaza and Egypt was how it was getting in, both overland and underground. So a big point of contention right now here in Israel, I mean, we had a huge protest the other night, the largest ever supposedly, with over 500,000 people in Tel Aviv alone, calling for Netanyahu to sign a deal, even if it means that Israel does not control the Philadelphia corridor. And the whole point of controlling the corridor would obviously be to make sure that no more anything is smuggled over it or under it. So as for Karen's question, do you think Israel should agree to give up control of the Philadelphia corridor in exchange for a ceasefire that would release all hostages? The simple answer is yes, I do. What does Joel think? I personally think we would. However, I don't believe it's actually possible, and I'll tell you why. The reason I think we would do it is because even though Netanyahu says that it's vital to Israel's security, most other people in the intelligence world, in the military world, are saying that we could continue to fight the war in Gaza and continue to contain Hamas, even if we gave up control of the Philadelphia corridor for a limited time, that getting the hostages out is more important. And that's why these protests have been held. Just tell Netanyahu, give up on your staunch stance that we need to keep controlling the Philadelphia corridor. Give up on that in order to just sign this deal to get all the hostages back. But here's the thing. I don't think it's actually possible. The more I watch what's going on and the more I hear about what's actually happening at these negotiations, it seems to me that Hamas does not actually want a deal. What Hamas wants is to drag out the negotiations as long as possible, because the longer the negotiations go on, the more time they have to rearm, to train new fighters, to get new weapons and supplies into Gaza and manufacture. So this idea that there would be a deal tomorrow if only Netanyahu or if only Israel were to give up control of the Philadelphia corridor, that the hostages would all come home, as Karen said. I think more and more Israelis are just starting to believe that that's not even a thing, that that's not even possible. I think a lot of us have lost faith that Hamas actually wants a deal at all. And it's sort of a slap in the face to all of us. We have to remind ourselves who we're negotiating with here. This is not a good faith party. This is not a good faith actor. This is Hamas. And they have an ulterior motive, which is to stay in power and to stay in control in Gaza. So I think it's misguided. I'm starting to think that these protests and these calls to just give up the Philadelphia corridor in order to get the hostages out, I believe that this is actually misguided, that we need to wake up and realize that there's probably not going to be a deal simply through diplomacy at this point. It just doesn't seem like Hamas actually wants one. So even though I would go for such a deal if it meant all the hostages could come home, and the majority of Israelis would want that, Karen, I just don't see it as actually possible. And that leads us to the next question, which is from Harold. And he asks, will yesterday's Tel Aviv protest, billed as the largest ever, really cause anything different to happen? Short answer, I don't think so. I mean, we've been protesting for 11 months now. Yesterday was the 11-month anniversary of October 7th. Hard to wrap our heads around that. Why would it work now if it hadn't worked before? I mean, so maybe there were, what, 30,000 more people at the protest last night than in previous protests? Would that 30,000 make a difference? Again, I don't think Netanyahu and those in power actually pay attention to these protest numbers. It doesn't seem like they are going to make policy around them. But like I said in the first question, I don't even think like there's a deal actually on the table. I don't even think that. I think we're being delusional if we think that merely protesting to get a deal signed would bring all the hostages home. It just doesn't seem, it seems very unlikely that that would actually happen at this point. So for two reasons, I don't believe the protests will cause anything different to happen. Last question. Someone unnamed asked, overall, who does Israel support for US president? I don't know that it's really relevant what Israelis think, but if you're curious, just anecdotally, and I don't know, maybe I saw one poll to back this up, but Trump is the one that Israelis anecdotally seem to prefer. I can't say it's a very sophisticated response that they prefer Trump. I think it's mostly a belief that the current administration, as supportive as it was for Israel in the beginning, is not supportive enough, certainly not lately, and seems to be talking out of both sides of its mouth. So I don't think they're really digging into the nuances of anti-Semitism in the US and whether it actually might be healthy to have a little bit of guidance on Israel as opposed to just taking off the leash. But if you're asking the question, at least anecdotally, and I think one poll I saw backs this up, most Israelis do prefer Trump over Harris. And we actually do have one more question. It's from Eric, and he asked, in light of recent events, how has the attitude on the street of Israelis changed, if at all, towards settlers in the West Bank? Now, Eric, this brings up a point I've made before, which is that I'm in a bubble. When I talk to you, I'm talking to you from my point of view, which is Ra'anana. My friend circle is pretty, I would say, intelligent, progressive. We're of a certain mindset. I think most of Ra'anana is like that, although not all. And I think, look, in my bubble, in my world, and that of a lot of Israelis too, we see more and more of the lawlessness in the West Bank. Uh, we're talking about the hilltop youth and the extremist settlers. We also know that this is bad for our own security. You know, Itamar Ben-Gvir recently paid another visit to the Temple Mount, and the head of the Shin Bet, you know, Israel's internal security service, came out and said that these visits to the Temple Mount by Ben-Gvir are actually giving Hamas exactly what they want. They're stirring up in the residents of the West Bank. They're making them angry at Israel. This will lead to more suicide bombings, more suicide bombers. It's playing into their hands. And he implored Ben-Gvir to stop. It hasn't worked. But, you know, so a lot of Israelis are very, very frightened of what these West Bank settlers can and are doing. And they see them as a real danger, especially when they go unchecked. But this brings us back to the first thing I mentioned about the bubble. Believe me, there are plenty of Israelis who believe in Itamar Ben-Gvir's slogan when he ran for office, which is Mikan Balabait. Who's the landlord here anyway? Meaning that this is the Jewish country. Why should we be paying any lip service at all to the Arab and Christian, the Muslim and Christian residents of Israel? It is not their country. There are plenty of Muslim countries in the world. We should not be bending over backwards to protect them, to worry about their rights. This is the one and only Jewish country on the planet. We should be worried about ourselves. If that means visiting the Temple Mount, which we should have the right to do, then we should do it. If it means torching neighborhoods where we see a threat, it means do it. Human rights out the window. This is the Jewish state. So this isn't just a fringe opinion. There are plenty of people who support those in the West Bank, or at least who don't see them as a threat, who really believe that they're just expressing Jewish sovereignty, which is what Israel is all about. And if you look now at the polls about who would win as prime minister, Israelis still want a right-wing government. There was a long time on this pod when I told you that Benny Gantz would be the next prime minister. I no longer feel that way. I don't think Yair Lapid will either. The left really isn't making much of an impact. I think too much time has passed. In all the polls, it shows that Naftali Bennett, the former prime minister, would actually have the best chance of winning as prime minister were elections held now. And most people actually believe that Netanyahu should be prime minister over Gantz or over Lapid. So I can talk to you from my point of view, but in terms of the general Israeli on the street, there still is that right wing bend. All right, when we come back, we're going to get to the meat of the episode, my commentary part, and I'll explain the title, the one where Joel vents. Give me 20 seconds and I'll be right back. Welcome back to Inside Israel. So far, the voice is good. So hopefully all good tonight, all kosher with the voice. I noticed that 3 questions showed up in the chat while during our break. So let's just quickly address those. We're actually going to go last to first. So Harvey asked, is it safe for U.S. citizens to travel to Israel? What else can we do? Yes, it is safe. I have a friend who arrived today, and he's coming for dinner in 2 nights. Getting here might be challenging. Certain airlines canceled flights. Certain airlines are now saying they will be flying again. But yeah, it is safe. If anything, I feel like Israel, in a way, internally is quite safe right now, simply because we're on such high alert for anything fishy, for anything out of the ordinary. So yeah, it is safe to come. As for what you can do or what else we can do, Harvey asked, as I've mentioned in previous pods, Dorit, my wife, is working tirelessly on different projects, and she now has a new project where she's working with lone soldiers who are Israeli. It used to be that lone soldiers we thought of them, or we still think of them, as the ones who come over from the US, England, Australia, South America to volunteer, and their parents aren't here, so they're lone soldiers. But about half of all lone soldiers are actually Israeli born, but they don't have connections with their families because maybe one of their parents was alcoholic, or the soldiers are gay or lesbian or trans, and so they're disowned by their families, or they simply want to serve in the IDF if they're from a religious neighborhood and their families disown them for doing that. So Dorita's right now working with Israeli-born lone soldiers, and I'm going to put in the chat her email address. If you don't have it, it's dorit.admoni@gmail.com. You can email her about ways to support those projects. But, as for what else you can do, just keep the conversations going. I would love to see you here if you can make it, any of those who can. I don't know where the volunteer needs are here right now, but I think what I've given you is a few good places to start. So someone else, Judith, mentioned, I read a column saying that Netanyahu actually doesn't want a truce because he believes the end of the war will bring the end of his power. Is this idea held by many Israelis? I don't know if it's true or not, but I can tell you that this is the view of the majority of Israelis. Like over 50% of Israelis do believe that Netanyahu is running the war with political considerations as his foremost motivation. Because the extreme right wing, Smotrich, Ben Gvir, and those guys, they've already said that they will pull out of the government if the war ends. They want a complete obliteration of Hamas. And so if Netanyahu were to make a deal, I think it would be in a way it's most likely it would be the end of his power. So many people do believe that. Do I think more soldiers are joining Hamas via the Philadelphia corridor? I doubt that they are right now because Israel is on the Philadelphia corridor. But I do think that they are training new terrorists. I do think Hamas is trying to actively recruit and build up its network, build, you know, recruit more suicide bombers in the West Bank. They don't want this war. They don't want to surrender. So however it's happening, I do believe that Hamas has an interest to try to keep this going longer so that they can rearm. Harvey's question, the next one, a little too complicated for Joel, so we're going to skip on to the commentary part. Okay. So again, this episode is titled The One Where Joel Vents. Here's what I want to do. What I want to do is tell you the truth about what it means to be Israeli right now, what it feels like for those of us living here. Now, I won't lie to you. I'm a little hesitant to do this because the reason I do this whole podcast, Inside Israel, and the reason I wrote Israel 201 is because I have a real deep love for Israel, and I do believe this is a magical place, and I want to share the magic of this place with you and give you the inside scoop on what it's really like to live here, to be Israeli, what Israeliness is all about. It's very special. It's very unique. And so I'm hesitant to now unload on you and tell you some of these very hard truths about what Israelis are going through, because it might distill some of that magic I'm always trying to communicate. But I'm going to do it anyway. And the reason is I really want you to know what the experience is like for us. This podcast wouldn't be worth anything if I just gave you the standard storyline that we're all used to. It really is important to me that you know and maybe even sympathize with what we are experiencing. So here's what I'm seeing and hearing among a lot of Israelis these days, specifically in the last 10 days since the discovery of the bodies of Hirsch, Poland, Goldberg, and the other 5 hostages. That really was a turning point for a lot of us. So there's a lot of hopelessness right now. A lot of Israelis I'm talking to just don't have hope. Don't have hope that the hostages will ever come home. Don't have hope that there'll be any sort of change in policy. Don't have hope that the war in Gaza is actually leading anywhere or that the residents of the North will actually be able to return home. So there's just this sense that this is just from conversations I'm having with people, whether it's friends or people I meet out and about at cafes or wherever I am. There's this sense of hopelessness, of not really believing that there's anything good ahead for the country, at least not in the near future. There's a lot of frustration, this feeling that we have been trying, whether it's by hanging posters or wearing yellow ribbons and dog tags or protesting around the country or posting on social media, that are trying to get the message out there of who Hamas is and who Israel is, and that it's just not working. So there's this sense of exhaustion, and what more can I do? A lot of people really don't feel like there's more. We want to do more, but we don't know what more we can do. Those of us who are against the government, we feel like that question before from Harold. We've been protesting for 11 months and nothing has changed. Those who are really set on destroying Hamas, we're not seeing it happen. We're not seeing the hostages come home. So it's just this frustration of like, what more can we do? Because we've tried everything in our power. There's also frustration about how the country is being run in general. I mentioned to you in the newsletter, Hebrews Magic, that I sent out last Thursday, that high school teachers are on strike right now. My high schooler has not been to school yet. Now, there was just breaking news that the strike may have been resolved, but this is a full week of classes. And it's not just the academics that our kids are losing out on. It's the social connection. Now more than ever, we need to be socially connected, especially our teenagers. Remember, these are the kids who went through COVID, doing a year and a half of homeschooling over Zoom, and now they're out of school again. So it's just this feeling that this country is not functioning. The residents of the North have been living in hotels for just about 11 months now. Hezbollah continues to bomb us daily with drones, with missiles. So there's just this feeling of what is the country coming to? And we don't know who to trust because we're hearing from some sources that the Philadelphia corridor is the one thing that's going to keep Israel safe. And then you have other people, generals, intelligence officers saying it's actually not that important. It's just a political consideration. We don't even know who to trust anymore. And that's part of the frustration that we're feeling. I'm also seeing a lot of anxiety. I mean, people are anxious, and the statistics back this up. One of the, I guess, the equivalent of the Surgeon General here in Israel recently spoke about how we're seeing levels of mental health, mental suffering, and PTSD, and uh, other mental, just in general anxiety at the highest rates the country has ever known. It's very, very hard to be Israeli right now. And along with all that is guilt. I see a lot of that too. This guilt that it's been 11 months, that on the one hand, we want to forget it. We want to go on with our lives. We want to be with our kids. We want to go on vacation. We want to pursue our hobbies, pursue our work, grow our careers. And meanwhile, we know that there are, what, 60, 70 still living hostages in Gaza. As we speak, as I'm talking to you right now, there are still Israeli hostages being held in Gaza. It's unfathomable that it's taken this long. And there's guilt along with it that whatever I complain about, it's really not that important. What right do I have to complain about anything or to want anything when there are hostages and families of hostages? So I think the psyche of the Israeli is very damaged right now and not healthy. And how are you seeing it actually play out? I think that's important to understand too. You see a lot of I'm seeing a lot more physical sickness in people, physiological, people who are just complaining of headaches and stomach aches and not being able to sleep at night. And they'll often say like, I'm not sure why I wasn't able to sleep last night. They're not saying it's because of everything going on. But the number of people who are saying that they're having trouble sleeping or that they're feeling nauseous or that they don't have the appetite they used to, or they have a larger appetite than they're used to as a way to compensate, or they just feel something is off with them physically. I'm hearing that a lot. There's just the general anxiety that in terms of actual panic attacks. This happened to me yesterday. I dropped one of my kids off at the mall, my 14-year-old, and we agreed that we'd meet again at 6:15. And when I came at 6:15, he wasn't there, and he's usually a very prompt kid. And I panicked because maybe in the old, one reason I moved to Israel is that I really feel it's so much safer than other countries. You can let your kids roam, you can let them walk around. Other Israelis are looking out for them. It's just sort of one of the benefits of living here. But I panicked yesterday because it entered my mind, like every parent's mind. What if they were kidnapped? Or what if there's a new kidnapping? And, you know, the worst nightmare comes true for me, for us. And I know I'm not alone in this. I've talked to other parents who said they walked into a store with their kid and then a minute later they couldn't find their child. And the first thing that came to mind is that they were kidnapped. They were taken by Hamas or Islamic Jihad or an Israeli citizen who's Arab living within the country who has affiliations with those organizations. So we're prone to these panic attacks and the worry. And along with it is the feeling that if God forbid someone we love is taken, we're not going to get them back. Who would you call? There's no authorities that we really believe in who would get them back. So this sort of tension, uh, it's worked its way into every nook and cranny of our lives. You're seeing a lot of tension just in daily life. The driving seems more aggressive than it usually is. And Israeli driving has a reputation for being aggressive, but I've actually felt it hasn't been as bad as it used to be. But it's starting to feel more aggressive. Dorit, who's so pleasant and so likable, got in an argument with someone recently over a piece of her artwork that was hanging in a restaurant, and this other woman just railed into Dorit in a way like you wouldn't expect. And you see that a lot too. People just losing their tempers and shouting and unleashing. And the woman later apologized and said, with everything going on, she doesn't feel like herself and she feels a lack of control. But is in Hebrew we use the word atzbaned, just riled up and nervous and short fuse. You're seeing a lot of that too. You're also hearing something probably you wouldn't expect that I'm going to tell you, but you're hearing a lot more about conspiracy theories. More and more people, smart people that I know and respect, are talking about how they feel it's all one big game. That Hezbollah had to look strong and Israel had to look strong. So Hezbollah and Israel brokered a deal where, whatever it was, 2 weeks ago, Hezbollah would open its rocket launchers to attack Israel and look strong, and Israel would be allowed to attack the rocket launchers so we could look like we were protecting ourselves. And both sides could feel victorious and happy and that it was all coordinated. There was a hostage release in the past 2 weeks, a Bedouin, Arab hostage. And the first news reports in Israel were that he escaped. And then later news reports said, no, he didn't escape. He was actually rescued by what's called Shayetet Shloshesrei, the Navy SEALs. And then other people started saying, yeah, but I work with the Navy SEALs and I know that they're not in Gaza right now, so it's all fabricated. And the government doesn't want us to know that they didn't rescue a hostage, that he was able to escape. And Hamas doesn't want us to know that they were allowed a hostage to escape. And more people are believing that stuff is coordinated, that there are parties talking behind our backs and just putting out the right narrative that we will hear, but that behind the scenes they're actually coordinating. And this is the type of thing I usually scoff at. I'm not a big conspiracy theory guy. But more and more, I find myself wondering too, like who do I turn to? What are the news sources that I actually trust? What is actually true? Because I know everybody has a motive. So that's another thing you're seeing here is more and more people saying just, I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know who to trust. I wonder if all this is just being coordinated behind our backs for the benefits of the people in power. So what would it take? What would it take for Israelis to come out of this? And funk isn't even the right word because that doesn't nearly do justice to what Israelis are feeling. But what would it take for us to feel whole again? You know, the Hebrew word for peace, shalom, is related to the Hebrew word for wholeness, which is shalem. Real peace means a sense of feeling whole. What would it take? Well, I don't think it would necessarily take a new government because, like I said before, not every Israeli wants there to be a new government. Some are perfectly happy with the government we have, or would want maybe someone else in power besides Netanyahu, but otherwise right wing. So I think it would take two things. Number one, if all remaining hostages and the bodies of the dead hostages were to be returned to Israel, it would bring a sense of closure. Whatever happens next in Gaza, however long the war would continue, however long our soldiers would need to be there, if hostages came home, there would be a sense of closure. And the second thing is that if residents of the North could return to their homes, that would be another thing that would give us a sense of, we can get back to normal life now. But you got to understand, none of us can exhale as long as 60,000 Israelis are still out of their homes. And as long as we have, I think it's 97 hostages, that includes the dead ones, still in Gaza, we don't feel we can exhale. We don't feel like we can fully relax into the people that we truly are. We're on edge. We're on high alert. We feel anxious and guilty and uneasy. Nobody thought that we would be approaching the 1-year anniversary of October 7th and that hostages would still be there. So those are the only two things I can think of that would allow us to return to a sense of normalcy. Is getting the hostages back, both the dead and alive, and allowing the northern residents to return to their homes. And someone wrote here, these are all symptoms of clinical depression. Yeah, it is. Israelis are suffering from various levels of depression and PTSD. Some have it very serious, others on less serious levels, but all of us right now. I don't want to mince words. It is a very, very tough time. The sense of hopelessness. We don't see any light on the horizon. What light could there be on the horizon after Hirsch and 5 others are shot at point blank range in the head? What hope do we have? And Hezbollah is bombing us yet again today. And on the border with Jordan, one of our countries that we're at peace with, a truck drives to the border and opens fire, killing 3 Israelis. What hope is on the horizon for us? And when you don't have hope, that's when depression sets in. So yeah, I think it is clinical depression. I'm sorry to have to leave you on that note tonight, but I told you, this is the one where Joel vents. This is the one where there's not magic and not that great narrative that we are still a part of. You know, Yossi Klein Halevi, who many of you know. And by the way, I have an interview set up with him. I'll be interviewing him for the podcast over the next month, which I'm really looking forward to. But I heard him speak in a different podcast recently, and he mentioned that he is on the ship, that whatever happens to that ship, sailing or sinking, he is on board. And if he means he goes down with it, he does. A lot of Israelis right now are not saying that. They're looking for ways to leave. They're talking about leaving the country, considering what other countries they might live in, because there's just not that sense of hope on the horizon. So yeah, I am sorry I had to tell you that, but that's the real truth of what we're going through. This is a very, very hard time to be living here. I would like to hear from you. You are the core audience who's listening to these live broadcasts on Sunday night. I'd like to hear, are you listening to the podcasts that are not live? I had an interview with Yoav Cohen about what it's like to do 100 days of military reserve duty service. An interview with Susan Weiss, who is the director for the Center for Women's Justice in Jerusalem. Drop me an email. Let me know if you're listening to those episodes. Those are not appearing Sunday nights. Those are dropped on Wednesdays when these Sunday night ones are not uploaded. I'd love to hear from you if you like them, if you want anything different. Who else you'd like to hear from as guests. Next week's podcast is going to be September 15th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, same as always. And if you need the links, again, I'll put them right here in the chat. It's joelchasnoff.com/podcast. I will be embarking on my fall tour in October. Actually, in the middle of Sukkot, I'm flying to the US for my fall tour. And you can look at joelchasnoff.com/shows to see where I'll be appearing. So there's two reasons you might want to do that. Number one, to come to a show that already exists. There'll be comedy, there'll be book talks, there'll be lectures on Israel, everything happening now. And also to bring an event to your community. If you want an event for your federation, your synagogue, your JCC, reach out because I still have dates open that will be filled by the time December comes around, but for the moment are available. And again, you can reach me at the address I just put above, joelchasnoff.com/podcast. Thank you so much for joining tonight. I'll leave the chat open for another minute. This has been Inside Israel with Joel Chasnoff. So great to have you, the core audience, week after week. It means a lot to me, and it makes this very hard time a tiny bit more bearable. Just knowing I can share it with people who genuinely care. Believe me, it means the world to me and to a lot of us living here right now. Until next week, Lehitraot, only peace for all of us. Bye-bye.